For more on Iran, just days ago in Tehran, they were chanting "Death to America," celebrating the 32nd anniversary of the fall of the Shah back in 1979. Well, as we heard, tomorrow the regime's opponents wanted to stage their own protest to support the uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, but the government has said no, it's cracking down by arresting political opponents, human rights activists, journalists, and even artists, all to stifle dissent. What will it take for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the mullahs to finally topple in Iran? Joining us now is Prince Reza Pahlavi. He is the son of the Shah of Iran and has been fighting to bring democracy and freedom back to his people. Prince Reza, good morning, and thank you for joining us here on the Fox News Channel.
Good morning, Eric. Thank you for having me.
We just heard the opposition's planning demonstrations in the morning in Tehran. If people show up, what do you fear could happen?
Well, you have to understand that the protests in Iran have not started recently, but have been going on for years, and particularly since about a year and a half ago, in the summer of 2009, which gave rise to the Green Movement, who is now encompassing the great majority of the Iranian people of different persuasions, but united in one single key demand, which is the freedom to be able to choose for ourselves, to elect who we want, to have the liberty to speak, something that this regime obviously is denying us. So it's a standoff, it's a show of solidarity, which I think a lot of people in Tunis or Cairo were inspired with, and in return, what has recently happened there can only be emboldening and encouraging to my compatriots who are today standing their own ground.
Well, it's encouraging to them, but sadly, it hasn't worked, and the past few weeks must be poignant for you. Your father was forced from power. Mubarak has been good to your family. At the same time, so far, the uprisings have failed in Tehran.
Well, I think it's an era of people's power. At the end of the day, it's people who have the ultimate voice, and it's the people who have to ultimately decide. If we were to believe in that, it would follow that we have to think in terms of empowerment. This is a different time. It's not the Cold War. It's not the West versus the Communist bloc. And as a matter of maintaining certain interests, some liberties are compromised. I am a firm believer in democracy and human rights. I believe in self-determination. And what we are facing today in my country is a regime that has been extremely repressive. Since you mentioned some arrests and some executions, since the beginning of this year, Eric, over 120 people have been so far executed, according to Human Rights Report. That's about 8 hours, one person every 8 hours. At this rate, we might have just 1,000 people executed in 2011 alone. Are we going to let that fly, or are we going to, for once, say it is time to endorse and support the demand of people who simply ask to be heard and have a choice? If Ahmadinejad or the current regime is going to continue cracking down, then the question becomes, what will the military in Iran, what will the Revolutionary Guards do? Will they stand against their own people, or ultimately let go of their hold on power to allow for a transition in Iran as well?
Well, we saw what happened in Egypt. It was pretty remarkable. In Tahrir Square, the Egyptian military turned the turrets away from the demonstrators. They supported them. They embraced them. Do you think it could get to a point in Iran where the Revolutionary Guard and the Iranian military would actually turn against Ahmadinejad and even the mullahs?
Well, look, the army of Iran back in 1979 was a professional army, like it is in Turkey, like it is in Egypt. The difference is, after 30 years, the big question mark is, has this regime managed to ideologize its military or paramilitary forces? And to what extent an ideological army would be more difficult to convince not to side with the regime and stand with the people. Having said that, in the last years alone, I can tell you that in most cases, Iranian armed forces and military have refused to intervene to be used as a tool to repress people. In fact, they told the regime, we're not going to do your dirty job for you, which means that the regime had to find recourse elsewhere, even import foreign nationals from Lebanon, from Palestine, to come and crack down on people. And they came up with the Basij as a unit that is simply doing the dirty work from the regime. Even some members of the Revolutionary Guards have refused to carry out such orders. And we saw those cases as recently in the last year alone, especially as a result of what happened back in 2009. Having said all of this, I think at the end of the day, I find it very difficult that the same Revolutionary Guard commander who fought in the Iran-Iraq war to protect the lives of the parents of today's generation who are in the street demanding freedom, to ask their troops to turn their arms against their children. That simply doesn't make sense.
So how do you get to that point?
I think it's a combination of what we need to do as Iranians at home, a very disciplined campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience, but we do have and we would like to be able to rely on the help from the international community of free countries that are going to this time change their overall strategy of unique dialogue with the regime to one of endorsement and empowerment of the people. Look, Eric, at the end of the day, apartheid ended because the world no longer could tolerate the continuation of it. Dictatorships in Latin America fell because democracy had to prevail. The Eastern Bloc countries were liberated with Lech Walesa and Václav Havels and the rest just because it was no longer tenable to live behind the Iron Curtain. And when you look at the Middle East, our time as a region has finally come. As I said, the people are now fighting tooth and nail to defend their freedom, totally unarmed, totally under-equipped, under a regime that is extremely repressive. The least we could do from the point of view of the free world is to stand by them, tell them that they're not alone, that their voices have been heard, and my job here is to convey that message to everybody in the outside world, that my compatriots in turn want to have their Tehran moment, as Egyptians had the Cairo moment, as Chileans had their Santiago moment, and Iran's turn is going to come up soon as well.
But you know, it's got to take more than that. It's got to take more than support around the globe. It's got to take some tipping point in your country for the mullahs to get out. And I think that's one of the issues that people say, what's going to happen?
Well, I think the majority of the clergy in Iran who have never been part of the regime since the revolution are agreeing to the fact that we have to have a secular democratic alternative in the best interest of the nation as well as the faith and religion itself. This is the most critical element to understand. The biggest damage has been done to religion and to the infrastructure of clergy as a result of an Islamic regime that in the name of religion has committed so many atrocious acts. So the best way for us to prevail is to find an alternative to this theocracy and replace it with a parliamentary secular democracy.
And finally, how do you make sure that happens in Tehran, and how do you prevent an Islamic radical takeover potentially by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt?
Well, I can't speak for Egypt or the Muslim Brotherhood, but I can tell you about, however, is that in Iran, nobody more than the Iranian people, as a nation that is predominantly Muslim, has understood the consequences of religious governance. They'll be the first one to tell you, don't make this mistake. We have paid a heavy price since 1979, and 32 years and counting. We've been bleeding, we've been suffering. The way out is not to find radicalism or fundamentalism or political Islam. Islam has its place as a faith. It ought to be respected. People have every right to practice their faith. But the guarantee is human rights, the guarantee is liberties that have to be encoded in our Constitution that protects every citizen's right of whatever faith they are, or even atheists, to be able to prevail and survive. The guarantee has to be in the law, and that law has to be man-made. If you want to go the other route, we are facing it right now in Iran.
Well, tomorrow they are calling for demonstrations. We have reports, as you say, that they are already saying, chanting death to the dictator in Tehran. Hopefully it will not lead to violence. Prince Reza Pahlavi, we thank you so much for joining us here this morning on the Fox News Channel. And we wish
My pleasure, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.